If you are sensing a new wave of craziness in the air, it's not you. Well, it might be you. I don't know what kind of day you had, but there is a national wave of craziness that you can sense in the air, and that is the anticipation, paired with a lot of sort of woolly reporting about that anticipation, that the president's personal attorney, Michael Cohen, is in the midst of dropping his legal representation because he's about to start negotiating with federal prosecutors to potentially cooperate with them in their inquiries. That anticipation, and again, the woolliness of the reporting around that issue, is making everybody in national politics a little crazy. It's honestly a little hard to get a bead on how serious the risk is here for the president and how much of the anticipation around this issue and the reporting around this issue may actually be spin that is advantageous to someone, and we don't know who yet. Joining us now to help us sort this out is someone who is very, very well sourced on this issue. Emily Jane Fox is a senior reporter at Vanity Fair. She has been covering Michael Cohen from the very beginning, as well as Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump. She has a brand new book called Born Trump, which comes out next week. Emily, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I describe woolly reporting here because I feel like everybody wants an answer to the basic question of whether or not the president has reason to worry that his personal attorney is going to start talking to prosecutors in a way that's going to pose a danger to the president. And I feel like everybody's leaning from the few facts that we've got into a potential answer to that question. But am I right that we really don't know if Michael Cohen is going to cooperate?
I don't think that Michael Cohen is 100% sure if he's going to cooperate right now. And I think that that's the honest truth. And I think that there are a number of people who want this to go one way and some people who want this to go the other way. There are a lot of steps that have to happen between where we are and what we learned today. And what we learned today was important. And it's a decision that, according to people around him who I spoke with today, this decision to change attorneys and the attorney's decision to leave the case that will happen at the end of this week has been something that they have been talking about for weeks, if not a month. So that is a big development, but there are a number of steps that we have to take in order to get to the next place, if there is a step to get to the next place.
Was it a mutual decision by Mr. Cohen's attorneys and Mr. Cohen that they should part ways at this point
There are
in the case?
a couple of reasons, like any good breakup. It depends on who you ask, and there are a number of reasons why it didn't work out. The first reason is that this case is entering a new phase, so the document collection phase and sorting through to deem what is privileged and what is not privileged, that ends on Friday. The deadline is Friday. That's over. The law firm that has been representing him and had 15 lawyers on this case, which is expensive and time-consuming.
15 lawyers around the clock, working weekends,
sleeping
everything.
on the couches in the law firm. They were very well equipped to handle this.
And just to be clear about that, millions of pieces of information and documents were seized by federal agents from Cohen's home and office and hotel room. And he and his attorneys asserted that many of those documents, thousands, if not millions of those documents, should be shielded from prosecutors because they were attorney-client work product. It was confidential communications between Mr. Cohen, who is an attorney, and his clients.
Sure.
There had to be a process of adjudicating whether or not that was true. That process ends essentially on Friday?
It ends definitely on Friday. That is the court-decided deadline.
So and so far, it has really not gone in Michael Cohen's direction, right? The court thus far, at least as far as we know, has decided that less than 1% of the documents that were seized have any reference to his clients.
There are very few that have to do with attorney-client privilege. So almost all of them will go over to the government.
Okay. So with that process, that very labor-intensive, very expensive process ending, that's one reason why Cohen and his attorneys might be breaking up.
There is also a dispute over fees. So as we just discussed, this is a very expensive process, and who pays for that at the end of the day? And there has been a dispute between the lawyers who currently represent them, lawyers who represent the Trump organization, and Michael Cohen somehow falls in the middle.
So what we know is that the Trump campaign, the Trump re-election campaign, has been paid something around $250,000 between the end of last year and this spring to the firm that was representing Michael Cohen. We had a funny incident, actually, that I'll tell you, which is that initially when those payments came out in FEC filings, the Trump campaign wasn't telling us what those payments were for. That firm could have been representing people other than Michael Cohen. Why? What kind of work was that? Was it something completely unrelated to Mr. Cohen? Was it just a coincidence? We then found in the FEC filings that they'd actually sent the check for those payments to the law firm to Michael Cohen's office in 30 Rock, which to us gave away that any ambiguity there. They were not just paying that firm for some other reason. They really were paying for Cohen. That itself is a little bit of a question, right? Because Cohen was never part of the Trump campaign.
He was absolutely left off of the Trump campaign for the express reason so that he could handle matters like this, but he was acting as in his capacity for the Trump organization.
Okay.
So the issue of why the Trump organization may or may not have to pay for these legal fees right now has to do with the fact of if Michael Cohen is in trouble because of what he had to do as part of the Trump organization, or if he's under investigation because of his outside business activities. And I think from two people who I spoke with who were directly familiar with the search warrants, something that the government was looking for were information related to the payment to Stormy Daniels and to other women, and anything having to do with communication to Donald Trump and the Trump organization.
Okay, I have a follow-up question for you about that, because that is sticking in my craw. Can you stick with us for just one second? Emily Jane Fox is a senior reporter at Vanity Fair. She's not supposed to be staying for a second segment, but I'm calling an audible. We'll be right back. Joining us once again is Emily Jane Fox. She's a senior reporter at Vanity Fair. She has been covering Michael Cohen from the very beginning, and she's very, very well sourced on this story that has transfixed a lot of the political world today because of the prospect that the president's personal attorney, his longtime personal attorney, former Trump Organization executive Michael Cohen, may be starting the process of cooperating with federal prosecutors. Thanks for staying with us, Emily. We were talking about the Trump Organization, the president's business. If part of the reason that Michael Cohen is breaking up with his lawyers is because there's a dispute over whether or not he can pay his bills, his quite considerable legal bills, why wouldn't the Trump Organization be paying those bills? I mean, presumably some of the stuff that Cohen is potentially on the hook for, the Stormy Daniels payment, maybe even some of the Ukrainian peace plan stuff that there's reportedly interest in, a lot of that stuff that he was involved in happened at a time when he was an executive of the Trump Organization, right?
Well, you were making Michael Cohen's argument, or anyone who would want the Trump Organization.
He and I are often in the same mindset.
I am sure you get that all the time. That is what someone who would want their legal bills paid by the Trump Organization would say, and that's a fair argument. I think that the Trump Organization has reason to distance themselves from Michael Cohen right now. They don't necessarily want to be tied to a legal defense for him. And also, the Trump Organization is not known for parting with its money very easily, and neither is the president. So I don't think that they're in the business of just, giving away tens and tens and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars for what could happen in this case.
You think back, though, to previous presidential scandals and the lengths that previous presidents, I'm thinking about Richard Nixon, have gone to prevent people from being tempted to cooperate with prosecutors, being tempted to tell prosecutors what they know, in part because they felt hung out to dry, or that they were being the ones who were left holding the bag when it was really the president on whose behalf they were acting. In this case, because Michael Cohen was a Trump Organization executive, the Trump Organization could legally pay him hush money.
Sure.
Could even have a rational argument for paying him hush money by paying for his legal fees if they so desired because of that business relationship. And yet they're choosing not to when his potential cooperation poses such a risk to the president. You
are speaking like a rational actor here, but the president has done nothing in order to make Michael Cohen feel like he has Michael Cohen's back, and that has been a problem. You forget that the president went on Fox News and basically said, I barely know the guy. He's like a coffee boy. He did a very, very small percentage of my legal work. Right. And then his attorney, Rudy Giuliani, has gone on television repeatedly making this harder for Michael Cohen. And the reaction from Michael Cohen, from everything I know from my reporting, has been, these guys don't have my back. And from the first time I interviewed him last August, the way that Michael Cohen spoke about the president was like you were talking about his father, his boss, his hero in life. He could barely walk by Trump Tower. He would get teary-eyed because he missed him being there so much. To now a man who is frustrated, isolated, feeling alone, and feeling very, very angry at the Trump family in general and at the president.
Last question for you. If Mr. Cohen, either based on those feelings or any of these other dynamics we've been talking about, if he does decide that he's going to cooperate with prosecutors and tell them everything he knows about his interactions with President Trump over the years, is that a potential serious risk for the president in terms of the president's own legal liability?
Yes.
Emily Jane Fox, senior reporter at Vanity Fair, who's got a book coming out next week called Born Trump. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for
Really
having me.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
We have so much ground to cover tonight. We haven't even gotten to the cat video. Cat video, very important cat video ahead. Stay with us.
Our show starts right now. Good evening, Rachel.
You do great work, my friend.
I'm trying to get it done. I'm trying to seal the deal here.
It is a pleasure to watch you work and to juggle those plates, man. Well done.
Thank you.
Thanks. And thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. Happy Hump Day. You know, we knew in advance that this was going to be a week with an impossible amount of news in it. That is definitely proving to be the case, but congratulations, you have reached the top of the mountain, or at least the top of the hump. It is Wednesday. It is all downhill from here. We're all going to be fine. President Richard Nixon had a personal attorney whose name was Herbert Kalmbach. Herb Kalmbach, Nixon's personal lawyer, went to prison in the Watergate scandal. 44 years ago this week, Nixon's personal lawyer was sentenced to 18 months in prison, but he only ended up doing about a third of that prison time. He only ended up having to serve about 6 months in prison because he pled guilty and he agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in the Watergate scandal as the president's personal lawyer.
Kalmbach showed no emotion. He said, "I'd like you to know how deeply embarrassed I am and how sorry I am to be here." Judge Sirica announced the sentence. Not less than 6 months and not more than 18 months with a fine of $10,000. Kalmbach left the court and went straight to a waiting car without comment. He is the 14th person to be sentenced for a crime related to Watergate.
As President Richard Nixon's personal attorney, Herb Kalmbach and his law firm did a lot of run-of-the-mill personal legal tasks for the president. They, for example, signed the checks for the president to make his mortgage payments. They made sure he kept up on his property taxes. They arranged the purchase of the mansion in San Clemente, California, that the Nixon administration liked to call the Western White House. Before Mar-a-Lago, there was San Clemente. But as Nixon's personal attorney, Herb Kalmbach also ended up to his neck in a lot of different kinds of shady and ultimately illegal Nixon stuff as well. Everything from Scott Pruitt-style straight-up Nixon grifting to bribes and corruption and illegal campaign finance. Ultimately, Kalmbach ended up right in the heart of the Watergate cover-up that brought down Nixon as president. Before President Trump's refusal to release his tax returns, the biggest example in presidential history of a president getting in trouble with regard to his taxes was Nixon's tax scandal about his vice presidential papers. This has sort of become an obscure thing. It probably never would have been resurfaced in modern discussions about the presidency were it not for Trump courting controversy about his taxes. But that's what sort of brought up again what Nixon had done that got people so upset about his taxes, that led to the modern precedent of presidential candidates all releasing their tax returns. Before Richard Nixon was elected president in 1968, of course, he had been vice president to Eisenhower for 2 terms. Separate and apart from the whole Watergate scandal, the reason we ended up with this tradition of candidates releasing their tax returns is because Nixon had a whole separate tax scandal. He cooked up this scheme where he declared that he was making a generous personal donation to the National Archives. What he was donating was his vice presidential papers from when he had been vice president to Eisenhower. He then put an enormous financial valuation on that donation of his vice presidential papers. He ended up claiming like a $500,000 tax deduction because of that self-proclaimed valuable gift to the country. And that was bullpucky in terms of tax law, but Nixon tried to get away with it. That Nixon tax scandal back in the day, that was a Herb Kalmbach joint. That was Nixon's personal lawyer, Herb Kalmbach. His firm arranged that whole Nixon tax scheme. Herb Kalmbach also served as a prodigious Nixon fundraiser. In that context, Kalmbach was involved in a scheme to take in what basically amounted to a $2 million bribe that was paid to Nixon's re-election campaign from an association of milk producers. Herb Kalmbach arranged that bribe, that gigantic campaign donation, in exchange for the Nixon administration changing its policy on milk prices. Kalmbach then structured the illegal bribe, that gigantic donation, to make it look like it wasn't just a $2 million bulk payment. When that started to become a scandal, Herb Kalmbach destroyed campaign donor records from the Nixon presidential campaign, which itself was against the law, even before we got all the post-Watergate campaign finance reforms. Herb Kalmbach was a very, very, very successful fundraiser in terms of the amount of money that he raised for Nixon by hook or by crook. After the 1968 presidential race, when Nixon won the presidency for the first time, the Nixon campaign actually had money left over that year, more than $1.5 million left over of money that they raised for that campaign, but they never got around to spending. And after Nixon got elected, Nixon's personal lawyer, Herb Kalmbach, essentially became custodian of that leftover campaign money. And that leftover campaign money basically became a slush fund that the Nixon White House tapped over and over again for all sorts of different Watergate-related shenanigans and scandals, including the ones that brought Nixon down. It was Nixon's personal lawyer who managed that leftover money. It was Herb Kalmbach who doled out some of that leftover money to Donald Segretti. Donald Segretti is somebody who Nixon put on the payroll secretly using the slush fund. So Segretti would spy on the Democratic Party and play dirty tricks on Democratic candidates. It was the president's personal lawyer, Herb Kalmbach, who arranged those secret payments to Segretti from the leftover campaign funds from '68. Fun fact, Donald Segretti and Herb Kalmbach later ended up going to the same federal prison. Aww. A lot of what happened in the Watergate scandal was, of course, driven by Richard Nixon's paranoia about whether or not he was going to get reelected in '72. Part of his election paranoia about '72 centered on the risk that he perceived from Alabama's segregationist governor, George Wallace. Nixon was worried that Wallace was going to mount a national comeback and run for president again in 1972. Nixon thought if that happened, if Wallace ran again in '72, Nixon thought for sure that would result in him losing the White House, because he thought that Wallace would siphon off the hardcore racist vote. Nixon needed that in order to get reelected, at least as far as Nixon's feverish mind calculated when it came to '72. And so Nixon decided he needed to stop Wallace's national comeback ahead of the '72 election. In order to stop that comeback, he decided he needed to stop Wallace from getting elected governor in Alabama again. Wallace was running for governor of Alabama again in 1970, and Nixon decided in order to save his re-election campaign, he needed to put the kibosh on Wallace right then and there. In order to kibosh Wallace in 1970, Nixon sent his personal lawyer, Herb Kalmbach, to deliver cash to Wallace's opponent, literally to deliver $100,000 in cash, in bills, money in a big bag, that Kalmbach handed over to benefit one of Wallace's opponents in that gubernatorial election in 1970. The way it worked was Kalmbach showed up with $100,000 cash in a bag. He met a stranger, somebody he'd never met before, in the lobby of the Sherry Netherland Hotel in New York City. The way he knew that that particular stranger was the right person to give the bag with $100,000 in it was when that stranger recognized the code words for that operation. Those code words were Herb Kalmbach, Nixon's personal lawyer, introducing himself as Mr. Jensen of Detroit. He was not Mr. Jensen of Detroit. He was Herb Kalmbach of Newport Beach, California. But that was the code word, and that's how they handed off the money. Nixon's personal lawyer. He was never a part of the Nixon administration formally, but he ended up involved in all of this shady Nixon stuff. Nixon's personal financial shady stuff, his tax shady stuff, his campaign fundraising, campaign finance shady stuff, Nixon's dirty tricks in paying for illegal spying. I mean, Nixon had his personal lawyer up to his neck and beyond in all of it. And so, of course, the guy ended up being right in the middle of the Watergate burglary, too, and the cover-up of that burglary and all the rest of it that ultimately turfed Nixon out of office. Nixon actually used his personal lawyer, this guy Herb Kalmbach, to be the bag man when he decided to funnel hush money to the guys who had carried out the Watergate burglary. Nixon gave the Watergate burglars over $200,000 in secret cash so they'd keep their mouths shut about the burglary. He had his personal attorney, Herb Kalmbach, assemble that money from a bunch of various sources, from the campaign to re-elect the president, CREEP, where Herb Kalmbach was a deputy finance chair. He also used some of that leftover slush fund money from the '68 election. He also added in some money from corporations that had started doing business with Herb Kalmbach's law firm, because after all, Herb Kalmbach was the president's personal lawyer. Probably a good idea to cultivate some good relationships there. Probably a good idea to send that guy some business. Sound familiar? Even though Herb Kalmbach was the guy who delivered that hush money to the Watergate burglars, it's interesting. He pled ignorance in terms of his own understanding of the scheme. Kalmbach said, yeah, he knew he was delivering secret cash, a lot of secret cash, to those guys who'd been caught in the Watergate break-in. But he said he assumed it was for humanitarian purposes. He says he thought it was to help the burglars' families. It was, of course, no such thing. It was Stormy Daniels-style hush money to shut those guys up, to keep them from talking about the burglary and who had ordered it and why it had been ordered. Herb Kalmbach insisted, even under oath, that although he was the bag man and delivered them all the money, honestly, he had no idea that's what the money was for.
But for the secrecy, this whole assignment, getting these funds to these people for this purpose, could get into the press and be misinterpreted. And then I remember he used the figure speech. He said they would have our heads in their laps, which again would indicate to me that it would jeopardize the campaign.
That didn't suggest you in the impropriety in your doing that?
No, I did not.
Why not?
It just it suggested to me that the concern was that this would have if it got into the press, misinterpreted, it would have.
How could it be misinterpreted?
It would misinterpreted in whatever way that funds were being given to these people.
Well, now how could your providing funds through either Mr. Dean's aegis or Mr. Ehrlichman's aegis through the committee to burglars, wiretappers, and conspirators be misinterpreted?
Well, the misinterpretation would be that this was being done to silence these people.
Well, could anybody have any other interpretation?
I did.
Richard Nixon's personal lawyer, Herb Kalmbach, saying during the Watergate hearings that he was under a different impression. When he delivered all that cash to the Watergate burglars, he didn't know that it was for any nefarious purpose. He certainly didn't know that it was to silence those people. You could hear the room laughing, right? That anybody would not understand that that's obviously what that money was for. But he insisted, seriously, under oath, that he didn't know that's what the money was for. Later, when the judge in the Watergate case, Judge Sirica, confronted Herb Kalmbach with the fact that, yeah, that was in fact hush money. That is what he'd been the bagman for. When the judge confronted him with that on the stand, Herb Kalmbach actually broke down and cried on the stand in Judge Sirica's courtroom. This was the New York Times on July 1st, 1974. When Nixon's personal lawyer, Herb Kalmbach, was on his way to prison. And look and pay attention to the date here, July 1st, 1974. Nixon was still president, but not for long, right? Nixon ended up resigning in August 74. But when this was written, when this was published in July 74, the president's personal lawyer, Herb Kalmbach, was heading to federal prison, and Richard Nixon was still president of the United States. Quote, Herbert W. Kalmbach will go to prison tomorrow, carrying what a friend described as a deep hurt over President Nixon's apparent displeasure because of Mr. Kalmbach's decision to cooperate in the government's prosecution of the Watergate conspiracy. Since his sentencing on June 17th, Mr. Kalmbach is said to have waited in vain for some word of sympathy or encouragement from the president, or at least an expression of gratitude for his 12 years of unquestioning loyalty. Kalmbach traced the president's attitude back to April of '73, when Kalmbach initiated his plea bargaining with the government, with government prosecutors with an offer of cooperation. Just a few days later, on May 1st, the White House announced that Herb Kalmbach was no longer the president's personal lawyer. While he had been Nixon's personal lawyer, it is amazing how many different aspects of Nixon's criminal liability Herb Kalmbach ended up personally involved in. I mean, he was the guy who actually paid the hush money to the Watergate burglars. And Kalmbach ended up cooperating and telling prosecutors and telling the Watergate committee that tale. What he ultimately went to jail for was a fraction of what he was widely believed to be implicated in. Kalmbach ultimately went to jail for an illegal campaign fund, an illegal and secret campaign fund that he'd set up with the Nixon White House to help Republicans win in the 1970 midterms. He also went to jail for effectively selling an ambassadorship in exchange for yet more campaign donations to Republicans. But even with just those 2 counts that they prosecuted him on, it looked like Herb Kalmbach would serve potentially years in prison, at least a year and a half in prison. Judge Sirica ended up springing him from federal prison after only 6 months, specifically because of Kalmbach's thorough cooperation with prosecutors as they continued to press on with the Watergate investigation that led up to and including the president's resignation from office. And it was less than 2 months after Kalmbach reported to prison that Nixon was gone too, resigned in disgrace, right? And then instantly pardoned for all his crimes by the vice president who took his seat. Today, when we got news that this president's personal attorney, Michael Cohen, appears to be making his own preparations to start talking to prosecutors, we called NBC News presidential historian Michael Beschloss to ask him once again, has anything like this happened before? All through the Trump scandals, all through the Trump administration, we've been asking Michael Beschloss seemingly daily, has this ever happened before? And the answer is always nope. But in this case, when we asked him today if there was any parallel situation in U.S. presidential history, anytime a president's personal attorney had ever been in this kind of jeopardy and in this kind of position with regard to serious accusations against a sitting president, for once, Michael Beschloss was able to tell us, actually, yeah, this has happened before. Herb Kalmbach went to prison. And that is something in American presidential history that casts a kind of shadow that looks a little bit like what might be going on with Michael Cohen and President Donald Trump right now. He also told us that the Herb Kalmbach story has not just a shadow, but also kind of a long tail that reaches directly to the Trump presidency, because the man who is widely believed to be President Trump's best friend, the wealthy investor Tom Barrack, you might remember him speaking at the Republican National Convention. He then became head of the Trump Inaugural Committee. You might remember that the Trump Inaugural Committee, like Nixon's presidential campaign, apparently generated way more cash than it needed and was left with a slush fund thereafter that has now come under scrutiny by federal investigators. Tom Barrack, you know what his first job was after law school? You want to know where he got his start in law and business? He worked for Herb Kalmbach. He worked for Herb Kalmbach's law firm and directly for Herb Kalmbach. During the first term of the Nixon administration, when Kalmbach was still Nixon's personal lawyer, before he went to prison and lost his law license, during the time when he was serving as Nixon's bag man, carrying around a bag full of $100,000 in cash, telling strangers in hotel lobbies that he was Mr. Jensen of Detroit to see who he was supposed to give these surreptitious cash for. That's when Tom Barrack was working for Herb Kalmbach. So once again, the scandals of this presidency prove that the past is never dead. It is not even really past. But right now, this week, over these next couple of days, in this incredible news week that we are having, we are about to find out the fate of the guy who is playing the role of Herb Kalmbach this time around in this iteration of presidential scandal and history. The reporting about the president's lawyer, Michael Cohen, today centers on the fact that he is reportedly losing the legal representation that he has had thus far in his legal troubles thus far, while he's been facing this criminal investigation by federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York. That scrutiny by federal prosecutors reportedly started with a referral from the special counsel's office, from Robert Mueller's office. That inquiry and that investigation by prosecutors in New York has thus far included a dramatic raid on Michael Cohen's home, his office, a hotel room where he was staying, and a safety deposit box early in April. Early in April is when we also learned that the Donald Trump re-election campaign had been paying Michael Cohen's legal bills for months. And I think when some people saw the headlines around that in April, it looked like maybe the Trump campaign was paying Michael Cohen's legal fees for him to represent Donald Trump. No. the Trump campaign was paying for Cohen's own lawyers who are representing him, which is weird because, like Herb Kalmbach, Michael Cohen is not a member of the Trump administration. And unlike Herb Kalmbach, Michael Cohen has never even technically been part of the Trump campaign. So what's the Trump campaign doing paying his legal bills all this time? It's never been exactly clear what Michael Cohen's personal legal liability is about, or what he could potentially tell prosecutors about if, like Herb Kalmbach, he decides to go state's evidence and cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for lenience in his own case. The single most worrying possibility for the White House is probably what was reported by BuzzFeed several weeks ago concerning Cohen's involvement in the secret pursuit of a Trump Tower Moscow real estate project during the presidential campaign. During the campaign, you'll recall that candidate Trump said that he had no dealings in Russia. We later learned that that was a lie. In fact, in the midst of the campaign, he had secretly signed a letter of intent to build what would have been the largest real estate project of his career, a Trump Tower in Moscow, which would require not just significant Russian financing. It would require high-level approval and assistance from the Russian government, if not from President Vladimir Putin himself. Well, several weeks ago, when reporting out that secret real estate adventure during the campaign and federal investigators' interest in that adventure, BuzzFeed News reported, quote, even before the appointment of Robert Mueller as special counsel in May 2017, FBI agents investigating Russia's interference in the election learned that Cohen was in frequent contact with foreign individuals about Trump Tower Moscow, and that some of those individuals had knowledge of or had played a role in Russia's 2016 election meddling. That BuzzFeed report cited 2 FBI agents as the source of that information. If in fact that's true, that means during the campaign, while secretly trying to arrange a major business deal for Donald Trump in Russia, Michael Cohen was in repeated contact with people who were directly involved in Russia's election meddling at that time to try to elect Donald Trump. If that's true, that would obviously be a serious concern for the Trump White House, particularly if Cohen is going to start cooperating with prosecutors and telling them what he knows about that. There's also the hush money payments themselves, which aren't a secret anymore. In Michael Cohen's case, the hush money payments are not to Watergate burglars. They're instead to women who said they had sexual relationships with President Trump. There's a number of ways in which those payments could be not just embarrassing, but potentially illegal. The president himself has already radically changed his public story as to how much he knew about those payments. That itself could potentially pose a significant element of criminal liability for the president. But then there's the matter of all the other people who have been paying Michael Cohen since Trump was elected president. As part of the legal wrangling over the Stormy Daniels hush money case, we learned about a number of corporate entities that mysteriously started paying Michael Cohen around the time that Trump was elected or when he was sworn into office. Among those entities is an investment fund closely related to a Russian oligarch. An oligarch who Cohen is known to have met with multiple times since the election. We don't know why the oligarch's investment firm was paying Michael Cohen, but the Atlantic magazine has since reported, just a few days ago, that that same oligarch was believed to be funding an effort to get the U.S. government to drop sanctions against Russia. An effort that Cohen was reportedly involved in during the presidential transition, one that was only interrupted by the New York Times exposing it. And that's just the stuff that's like off the top of my head in terms of what Cohen's been involved in terms of what liability and exposure the president might have if his personal attorney, Michael Cohen, is in fact dropping his legal team now because he now needs a different kind of expertise because he's now about to start cooperating with prosecutors. How do we know if that is what's going on here? And what's going on between the president and Michael Cohen as Cohen makes this almost unbelievably fateful decision? We've got answers to those questions next.